All right, so up to this point, we've been focusing on just being able to retrieve data from the server. Oftentimes, we also need to be able to send data to the server. Although you could use get to send data. I mean, we have, right? We've through the path parameters and the query string, we have been sending data to the server, right? But that's a very limited way of sending data to a server, and it has many drawbacks. One of them is very limited space, right? The query string and the path the path and the query string has a limited size. Browsers will typically truncate if the URL is too long, also the URL typically would be in plain text, right? So if you're sending any information that has private information, you would not want to be passing, in clear text. So ideally, you would instead use post to do this. Post doesn't have those kinds of limitations. The information is actually encoded as part of an HTTP body that's passed into the server, and you could additionally encrypt the content before it's being sent over to the server. It's also, as we'll see in a minute, it's based on the good practice of using RESTful services where we use get for basically what the name suggests, to retrieve data, post to create data, and as we'll see in a minute, delete for removal, obviously, and then put for modification of data that already exists. So let's talk about post and being able to send data over to the server. All right, so let's start with perhaps with our first object that we might want to send. Perhaps we want to be able to log in, or we want to register, or we want to pass in some user information. So let's create a data model for a user for where we want to pass in at least a username, password, first name, and last name. All right, so let's do that. All right, so let's create a data model for a user. This might be user. And as part of the user model, let's create a private string username, private string password, and maybe private string first name and private string last name. Okay. Plus maybe the setters and getters that go along with this. There we go. All right, so we have a user. Probably we might need a constructor. We'll see in a minute if we need it. Let's see. Where's my? Oh, there we go. User. So here's we'd like to be able to create a user. So to create a user or create anything, typically we would use a post instead. Right? To be able to retrieve user, we would use a get. To be able to delete a user, we would use a delete. And to update, we'd use an HTTP put. So let's create a service that handles user manipulation, right? So here in services, let's create a user service. So let's here have a user service, and in that service, let's annotate it as a RESTful service. So REST controller, and we would like to create a new user. So this would be a public user create user. So user, right? So user, presumably it's this user that we just created. That user, yeah. And for now, let's just echo the user back. Right? You sent us a user. I'm just going to send it back to you just to make sure that this works. So we're going to say return user. Right? So if it echoes exactly what we sent, we know it got there. Okay? So the way we're going to send it is through a post. So this is a post mapping. And we're going to map it to what? Well, here's the first introduction of using RESTful services. The idea of RESTful services is that the URL here the URL here shouldn't be just anything you want, right? It has a particular syntax and a meaning, right? It has some semantics, right? One of the semantics is that it should have the name of whatever it is that you're manipulating, right? Whatever data you're manipulating. In this case, we are manipulating users. We're creating users, retrieving users, updating users. So it should have /user somewhere in there. Ideally, it would be the last at the end of the URL, right? So this would be a very appropriate URL endpoint. The other thing that's not necessarily REST, but certainly is a concern that you might have realized. Why are we? Oh, here. That you might have realized here is that notice that this / message is pointing to this data, right? It's returning actual data, right? As opposed to this index HTML is returning static HTML. See that? So this server could return either of two things. It could return static HTML content alongside with CSS and JavaScript, everything that a server would consider to be static, right? Actual files that are living in some file system. But it can also return dynamic data, right? So that our server could return either one. And so we want to be able to make a distinction between what it is that we're returning, right? And that there wouldn't be any confusion between returning static HTML, static JavaScript, static CSS, as opposed to being able to return dynamic data, right? So to make the distinction, we're going to be using a very common naming nomenclature that everything that starts with /API, we're going to make a convention here. We are going to agree that anything that starts with /API is meant to return only data. Okay? That if it doesn't start with /API, it's meant to be perhaps mapped to an actual file, an actual static content. Make sense? Right? This is a very common prepending that of a URL widely used in industry. Other uses might be to use REST in front of it or data. Okay, those are all very common. Right? The most common that I've seen so far is /API. It's the most common one. I mean, this is an API, right? /user, you're interacting with a particular API that is being exposed out to the world. Make sense? All right, so we have that. Let's restart the server, right? And it'll make this /API/user available as an endpoint. To try it out, we're going to need to send a post. Now right now we've been sending our requests, our GET requests. We've been sending it right from the browser. Right, which is okay because the browser, that's all the browser knows how to do, is send a GET request. That's all the browser knows how to do. We can't force it to send a post unless we're using maybe JavaScript. Okay? But let's not do that just yet. So instead, let's use a very useful tool called Postman. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. That we're going to send a post to. We're going to send a post to this URL. Let me create a new one here. We'll call it webdev fall 2018. And here we're going to create a brand new request. Let's close these. Save it. Let's close that, and let's create a new one. So I'm going to create a post. And the URL is presumably http://localhost 8080 /API/user, right? User. We want to send we want to send in the body something that maps to that JSON. So it should be a username, perhaps. Let's send Alice. We have maybe password. So we're following the same naming convention as the object user, right? And presumably these will map to those fields in that object. Right? So this is password Alice as well. And we might have first name Alice, and then password, last name Wonderland. Right? So we're going to send that. We're going to post that. We also need to tell it, how to encode this. Right? Is it just a plain old string? What is it? Instead, we're going to say that the content type is going to be JSON. There it is. So we're saying this body is not just any string encoded in the body of the HTTP, encoded as JSON, right? So the server is going to say, it's JSON. I can parse it. It's not plain old string. It's JSON. I can try to map it to what I'm expecting. Okay. All right. I think we're almost ready. Let's send it. I think I'm forgetting something. Let's send it. It didn't work. All right. It didn't seem to work. I think I forgot something here. Yes, we forgot something. What I need to be able to say is where am I getting this user? This user, who's passing it to me? Presumably, I would like to be able to parse the JSON that is coming from the server that is embedded in the body of the HTTP request. I would like to unwrap that JSON object and somehow instantiate this user that is being passed to me as an argument. Right? So to do that, there is another incantation. We can say request body. Request body says parse the body from the request, instantiate the user. Presumably, the JSON object that is coming can be mapped, field by field, data type by data type, into an object of this structure. That the structures of the JSON that's coming in and the structure of the user class match, the schemas match, so that you can actually instantiate it. All right? So let's try that again. Let's try that again. So let's send it again. This time it worked, right? Whatever we're sending, notice that the response echoes exactly what we sent. Okay, everybody good? All right, so now we've been able to send information across. Right? Ideally, we could perhaps add it to a list of users. Right? So we could have several users being added to maybe to a collection of users, and then perhaps retrieve those users. Right? So, for instance, we might have here, as part of the user service, we might maintain perhaps a list of users. So list users new array list of users. Okay. Perhaps we could say users.add the user in question. Okay. And maybe what we could do is not just return the user we just created. Maybe we could just return the entire list of the users. Right, and just return users. So we could see, the array of users that we've been adding so far, right, of everybody that has been registered. Okay. So let's try it again. Let's restart the server. Okay, now let's try this again. Notice that the object right now is returning as a single object. So let's send it again. Notice that what comes back now, it's an array, right, where Alice is the only element in that array. And if we send someone else, maybe Bob Marley, and we send Bob Marley, notice that now we have both Alice and Bob added to the array. Right, we can maybe add Charlie, and Charlie. Garcia. You can send that, and notice that we have both, all three, right? Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Okay. All right, excellent. So we've been able to create it. Let's now. I think we have enough to start discussing REST as a concept. All right, let's take a look at RESTful services.